So welcome to Realise Resilience. We're delighted that you can join us again, and I'm super happy and very grateful to be joined by Marina Fogle today. Marina, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's awesome to be connected. Like I said before we came on camera, I'd done a lot of research on you guys, and as I mentioned, my sister recently read a book and was overnight has become your biggest fan. So it's really beautiful to be connected today. And before we jump in, I wanted to give a brief introduction to Marina. Marina is the producer of the weekly podcast, The Parenthood. Marina is also the co-founder of the Bump Class, and you're a regular writer, author, and we're delighted to have you. So thank you for giving us your time.
It's a pleasure. It's actually really lovely to talk to someone else who's not my family right now, because it's been quite a long time in quite a small household. So it's lovely to see a new face.
Well, likewise, we can. I'm sure you're not the only person feeling that. So it's great to connect. And as we've talked about in various different interviews that we've hosted for Realise Resilience, the idea behind this campaign, this movement, if you like, is to share stories of resilience, and through those stories to help inspire, motivate, and give hope to individuals that may be experiencing adversity. We've all went through a difficult period as a nation, where adversity has been shown up in lots of different ways. So it would be awesome to jump in today, Marina, and for you to share your own story of resilience. And if you're open to it, we can see where it takes us.
Absolutely. So do you want me to talk about the loss of my son? Is that what you want me to talk about?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, some of the adversities and the challenges that I've read about from your own story and through the research is the loss of your son and your miscarriage that happened in 2008 as well. So it would be great, to learn more about that experience and to hear your own story of resilience.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in a way, I didn't have to be very resilient when I was growing up. I was so fortunate to live in a family that, was loving, and I had everything I needed, and I had the attention of my parents, and had a great education. And, I suppose in a way you have to be a bit resilient for life. Actually, probably the time I needed to be most resilient was when I went to boarding school at 11, and I really, really missed home, and I missed the lack of loving environment. And I suppose that was my first experience of having to be quite resilient. It's not something that I'm planning for my children, certainly not at that age and in the way that it was for me. But it definitely does make you a little bit tougher, although it was quite a tough thing to experience when I was so young. And I suppose then afterwards, the biggest challenge for me was when I miscarried. It was my first pregnancy, and it wasn't something that I was particularly prepared for. I didn't realise that you can have a miscarriage with no outward example of having no outward symptoms, as it were. So I went for my 12-week scan, and I was told there was no heartbeat and that the baby died, and that was a real shock. Should I just tell people to be quiet? Can you hear this?
Yeah.
Is the sound all right? Is it okay?
It's okay.
Shall I just quickly be a little bit quiet, because my husband has the loudest voice in the world. Ben, Bobby, yeah. I'm just recording a podcast, so could you just be a bit quieter in this room? Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
So much easier when you just got your house to yourself.
This is real life at the moment, Marina.
It's true. It is real life. So I suppose what made that experience a bit tougher is that I realised that I'd had a miscarriage a few days before my husband Ben was about to go to the walk to the South Pole, and he was going to be off for 2 or 3 months. And I remember saying to him, "You've got to still go. I really want you to still go." But I had to go and have an operation, to resolve my miscarriage. And he was due to be doing interviews and packing and press and all of that kind of stuff. And he said, I won't do that. And I said, don't worry, you can, my mother will come with me. And I think that was tough on him. It's probably less tough than me. I think sometimes if you're the subject, you sort of feel that I think he felt incredibly guilty. But I think one of the best things I did was talk about it, to be open. There's this weird, I think it's quite weird, tradition where you don't tell anyone about your pregnancy in the early stages in case something goes wrong. But having experienced things going wrong, I've realized that you need your friends around you more than ever. And to be on your own and to suffer in silence and to not have the support of your friends during a really difficult time is only going to make it harder. But I ended up telling friends of mine, and I also did an interview with The Telegraph with an amazing journalist called Cassandra Jardine. And she said, I felt that it was important to talk about it, not because I wanted attention, but because I'd never really talked to anyone who'd had a miscarriage, and clearly these things happened, and it would surely be a good idea to talk about things that happened. Anyway, so she interviewed me, and not only was it good to talk about it from my point of view, but she was also so reassuring. She said to me, you know, I've got 5 children. She said, I've also had 5 miscarriages. And at that point, I realized that one of my biggest fears was that I wouldn't be able to have children, and her sharing that with me, that she'd had 5 miscarriages and yet had 5 children, was the most reassuring thing I could hear at that stage. And had I not opened up and let her, in, I wouldn't have had that, I wouldn't have had that conversation with her. But then after the interview was published, yes, it was quite an intimate thing to be published. And I know a lot of people would say, maybe you're sharing too much. But I had so many people contact me saying, thank you so much. And even today, I mean, this was 11 or 12 years ago now, I still have people saying, I read your piece in The Telegraph online, or I remember reading it years ago, and it was so reassuring because I sent it on to someone else who's having a miscarriage. And that felt like the right thing to do. But I was very lucky because I got pregnant again pretty quickly, and I had my son Ludo, who is now 10, and then pretty swiftly afterwards, Iona, who's now 9. And then we were pregnant for a 3rd time, which was very exciting. It was all pretty straightforward. And then at the end of my pregnancy, I was 34 weeks pregnant. I had something called the placental abruption, where the placenta kind of bursts away from the side of the uterus and you hemorrhage and the baby's starved of oxygen. And this all happened really suddenly while we were away in Austria. And I was rushed into hospital, and I had to have an emergency cesarean, and I was under general anaesthetic, and I woke up to find that my son had been stillborn, and that I had very nearly died as well because I'd lost so much blood. Ben was on the other side of the world because he was in Canada at his grandmother's 100th birthday, and so he was racing to get back. I was lucky because my mother and my sister were with me. My sister's a doctor, and so she was great at sort of dealing with the situation, but tough on her to have to, break to her brother-in-law that his child is dead and his wife might be too. And I remember Ben saying, the hardest thing was getting on a flight and just not knowing what message he would get when he landed, whether I would be alive or whether I wouldn't be alive. And, when we finally saw each other, his first words to me were, I'm so glad that you're still alive. Whereas I was grieving our child. We had 2 very different sort of prerogatives, and I absolutely got it from his point of view. But it meant that the grieving process was slightly different for both of us. I was in hospital for about a week, and I was pretty sick. I was in intensive care for about 5 days, and there was that physical recovery. But then there was also the emotional recovery. I felt bizarrely very numb for the first few days. I didn't cry for a few days. I felt totally, totally numb, and I wanted to see my children. But then the grief sort of hit, and it was a big shock. I think the hardest thing was, waking up in the morning and thinking, did this really happen? I couldn't believe this had happened to me. By this stage, I was teaching antenatal classes. I was very involved with people who were pregnant in the pregnancy world, and I didn't know one person who'd experienced stillbirth, not one person. And I felt, worried that maybe this meant that I couldn't continue my job, that I couldn't continue to, teach antenatal classes and be really positive about birth. That's one of our biggest our biggest challenges, because there's so much negativity around birth. I wanted people to embrace birth and obviously be safe, but not fear it. And here I was, the worst thing that could ever happen to you had happened to me. But But amazingly, actually, I had wonderful support from the women I taught over the years. I had, like, it was like floodgates opened. I had cards and emails and flowers, and it was so humbling and so healing to have that response from people. I felt, you know, it was so easy to feel alone because this unique thing had happened to me, and yet I didn't, because I felt like so many people cared. And that was probably one of the biggest positives, but also the biggest things that helped. I remember feeling quite ashamed when he died, that when friends of mine's parents or family members had passed away, that so often I'd not got in touch because I felt I couldn't think of anything to say. And I also thought, well, nothing I can say will make it any better. And I realized that, being bereaved myself, that saying you don't need, no one expects you to bring that dead person back. No one expects you to make the situation better, but simply caring and showing you care already makes it feels so much better. It felt like the people who didn't contact me didn't care. And I'm sure that wasn't the case, but that's how it felt. So I've, you know, since then been a real advocate of encouraging people to get in touch when friends are bereaved, because I think just reaching out and even just sending a text message with a couple of kisses, it just shows that you're thinking of them, and that does bizarrely make you feel quite a lot better.
Yeah, wow. And thank you for sharing, Marina, because there's many things that you've said which really resonate with me. I've had friends who've went through bereavement in the past 3 months alone, and what struck me as you went through those two obviously terribly challenging periods, when you talked about your miscarriage in the first instance, it was speaking to others, it was sharing with others, it really helped you move through that period, and without doubt helped others, by the response that you got as well. And then the second period, as you experienced your son being stillborn, that connection again, that sense of connection, albeit people reaching out to you and letting them know, or letting you know that they care, it's really quite remarkable how much human connection through sharing, through messaging, through calling, can have such a profound impact and an important impact when people are going through challenges.
Absolutely. And it's something that doesn't take training. It takes confidence. I think it can be quite intimidating for some people to call someone up or to reach out to someone who's bereaved. But I think it is such an important thing to do. And I think it's really important for society to understand how important that is. I think very often I definitely found there were people who were great, and there were people who just weren't great. And it wasn't that they cared any less. It wasn't like they didn't want to support me. They just didn't know how. They didn't have the vocabulary. They didn't have the confidence. They didn't have the understanding. And, we experience death pretty rarely nowadays. It's quite unusual for something that happened to me to happen to anyone. If you look back 200 years before, death was a much bigger part of life, and people were much better at dealing with it. And it's almost like we've lost that ability to support people who are grieving and to give them, the confidence to talk about it. There's an element of sort of feeling guilty that you're going on and on and on about your dead child, and shut up already, get over it. There's definitely, and that might well have been self-inflicted. But I feel really strongly that we do have to talk about it, because me talking about my experience undoubtedly helps other people. But not only does it help if you've experienced grief, it helps if you're supporting someone who's experienced grief. And I've done quite a few podcasts around that, talking about baby loss for one, which I think is really important because it happens, but people don't talk about it. So people think it happens a lot less than it is. I mean, I actually think that we need to talk to children about miscarriage, because, I think we talk to them about pregnancy, we prepare them for life. And yet I see so many dads who are like, I never even heard of miscarriage. And then my wife had a miscarriage, and suddenly this thing happened to us that I realize is really common, but no one had ever talked about it. So actually, I think when we're teaching our children about sort of sex education, we should talk about birth and reproduction, but we should also talk about miscarriage and just introduce the concept when they're young, so it's a part of life, because it is a part of life, and not talking about it doesn't make it any less of a part of life. It just simply it is there. And I think it's really important for people to be aware of it.
Absolutely. And, you know, I feel very strongly about the subject as well, where, you know, typically we create taboos throughout life, or we create subjects that people feel awkward around approaching and uncomfortable, which, like you said, may lead to someone not reaching out because of the uncertainty around that. Whereas if we begin that, you know, that communication and that conversation at a much younger age, then all of a sudden we're able to help our children appreciate that there are different experiences in life that will come along, but we're better preparing them for that experience, you know, through emotional regulation, through helping them with their ability to communicate as well. So I think it's such an important point that you mentioned. We have a little girl, a 4-year-old, and, you know, we talk to her about death as well. We teach her about the concept of death, and she asks curiously about it. And I think it's important, you know, to help shape, you know, well-rounded little human beings who are growing up and going to be leading this next generation, if you like.
But I also think, you know, we have this tendency to sugarcoat things for children and therefore not tell them the truth. You know, so often when children are talked to about death, they'll say, oh, you know, grandpa went to sleep and never woke up. If you think about that, that's terrifying, because you get your children to go to sleep every night. And are they then thinking, well, what if, like grandpa, I never wake up? You know, and it's not sleep. Death is very different to sleep. And it's so important that children are talked to in an honest way about what death is and what those risks are. And I don't think we're doing our children any favors by sort of sugarcoating it. You know, the other thing is that they realize pretty quickly if you're not telling the truth. And then you're teaching them that you won't always tell them the truth, that you'll pretend to tell them the truth, but it might not be the truth. So then you try and reassure them and they think, well, can I actually trust you that this is the truth? I feel really strongly that we need to be honest with our children right from the beginning. And they ask difficult questions, but, you know, I'm not saying expose them to horrible, violent films, but actually whatever question they ask, you need to answer it honestly. I can't think of a question in which that my children have asked that I haven't felt able to answer this honestly. We were just talking this week about, you know, the race issues in America and what's going on. And, you know, I feel really strongly they need to know about civil rights and slavery and all those different things are pretty difficult to hear, right from an early age, because it means that my children are never inhibited to ask a question and they always know they'll get an accurate answer. And I think that leads to much less fear about life, because you can frame it in a way that is easy for them to understand, but also less scary, not by not telling the truth, but by focusing then on resilience. How, you know, with coronavirus, you know, I didn't pretend that people weren't dying from it, but I focused on how we were keeping ourselves safe and what we could do to, you know, get control of the situation, why they didn't need to worry specifically about coronavirus. And that was much more reassuring than, you know, if you are quite worried yourself, than just not talking about it or inventing some, you know, infantilized story around actually a very serious issue that you can't infantilize.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's really interesting, as you were talking there, Marina, it made me aware that, you know, fundamentally this is all linked to resilience and helping our children realize, you know, their resilience and to cultivate it and develop it so that when things do happen in life, they're better equipped and better prepared to move through it. Now, it's not to say that situations and challenges show up that will cause trauma and will be, you know, a shock or an experience that we never expected, but the children, if you like, and us are much better prepared when we've had the open dialogue to explore subjects and concepts that typically are more difficult to talk about.
Absolutely. And I also think you can frame difficult times differently. You know, you can frame difficult times as, oh God, this just makes our lives more difficult. Or this gives us the opportunity to grow and learn. A bit like, you know, I was playing tennis with my kids the other day. It was really windy and it was really difficult for them to have the wrong balls. And they were like, this is so difficult. I was like, but difficult makes you better. It makes you better at tennis and it makes you better with the ball. And I slowly, that's what we're trying to do. You know, if everything is always perfect, you're not really learning enough to navigate the world, because the world's not always going to be perfect. It's a bit like, you know, I talk a lot about this sort of quest for perfection that parents have. And so often parents strive to be perfect. They're always measured. There's always delicious food on the table. Mummy never gets angry. Children are always, you know, beautifully turned out, and they're never late for school. It's not achievable, but B, it's a really rubbish preparation for life, because if that's what they think life is like, everyone's measured, everyone's kind, everyone has time for the children, they're going to get to 18 and someone's going to snap at them or shout at them or be really unfair to them, and their world will fall apart, because this wasn't the world they thought they were going to be prepared for. Much better that as a parent, you mess up sometimes and you shout at them and you go, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done that. You know, everyone has bad days, because it teaches them that everyone's not perfect, and also that it's okay for them not to be perfect, as long as they can learn from that and apologize. Two really, really important things. I think actually, you know, imperfection and letting your child grow up and learn from imperfect situations is the biggest favor you can do for them. It will give them so much strength. And you know, listen, education is very, very important, but, you know, whether or not they know the 8 times table is going to be pretty irrelevant. Education is much more about building resilience in a peer group, about having someone being mean to you, or, you know, what are you going to do when you see someone being mean to other people, or when your teacher's a bit ratty, or when you do have to wait for your question to be answered. That will teach them so much more than, you know, whether or not they know their, you know, square numbers.
Absolutely. And even seeing mum or dad being imperfect, it kind of gives them permission also to be okay with when they're not perfect. You know?
Absolutely. And also, you know, crying is another big one. I was talking to someone recently, and she'd been very, very concerned about coronavirus. And, you know, once we could see other people sort of socially distanced, I said, why don't you come and see us for, you know, I'll have lunch in the garden. And she said, no, I'm way too worried. I said, but you don't need to be worried. There's no risk if you come down, or there's very little risk. She said, I'm just worried, you know, what if your children see me crying? Because I could just break into tears. I said, well, you know, they see me cry the whole time. They can't pretend, you know, I'm not going to pretend to them that grown-ups don't cry, because actually, if you don't cry in front of your children, you're teaching them that it's not okay to cry. And actually, the more we understand about our brains and our emotions, the more we understand how important it is to cry. It's a really important physiological process. And actually, I said, you know, you crying and showing your vulnerability to my children, that a grown-up can be vulnerable and she's not ashamed of it, that is like, I would pay for that experience for them. It's such an important experience. And it was interesting how she regarded that as the ultimate weakness, and I regard it as the ultimate strength. And that's what, you know, I want my children just, I cry in front of them the whole time. I've become such a crier. I mean, literally every Thursday night we clap for the carers. I'm in floods for tears and Mummy is off again. But I do think that showing that vulnerability and showing to them that, you know, it is okay to cry, especially for boys. You know, this idea that boys don't cry, big boys don't cry, you're a big, you know. I want my son, sorry, I'm just getting rid of the phone call that came in. Especially my son, I want him to be the kind of man that will be proud to have the myriad of emotions that enable him to empathize and cry and feel emotion and happiness and sadness in big swathes. That will be a badge of honor for me.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I'm smiling because my daughter's seen me cry on many occasions, writing my gratitude and appreciation list in the morning. big boys definitely do cry.
Yeah.
But it is such a beautiful message. You know, I grew up in probably a circumstance and environment that, you know, you never seen men crying. You know, it wasn't the to-do thing. And I now have the fortune of working with many men, and the emotional side and that vulnerability is still so difficult for them to access and to express. And yet, you know, it is such a powerful thing. It is. Yeah.
And you feel better after a good cry. I definitely found, like, after Willem died, it was obviously a very profound grief that I was feeling, and I cried a lot. And then as time went on, I cried less and less. But it was almost like I would store this grief, and then at one point I needed to cry, and I got really good at it. I'd literally just go for a walk or go somewhere and just bawl. for like 10 minutes, properly visceral sobbing, really, really physical, almost like, it was like a purging. And then I'd be like, okay, that's good. I'm fine. Okay, I'm good now. But I just recognized that I needed to have that cry. And I see that with my children. Sometimes they just need to have a really good sob and get that out and acknowledge those feelings. Because, you know, sometimes we are ashamed of the feelings that we have. You know, I did an interview yesterday with a psychologist about the sibling relationship, and she just said, you will feel frustration and anger and jealousy around your siblings. That is a part of who we are. It's how our brains are constructed. It's a sort of hangover from the primal days when, you know, attention from your parents meant you didn't die. And so it's natural to feel jealous and angry and have a bit of sort of sibling rivalry. But you have to acknowledge those feelings in order to think rationally about them. And I think that's really important for the children to be aware. You know, there will be times that they'll be sad or frustrated. And if they can be in touch with those feelings, identify those feelings, name them, and actually celebrate them. Because actually it's you know, we're such sophisticated creatures. We are probably, you know, we're the only creatures that experience emotion on such a broad level, and that's something that we should be really proud of as people.
Totally. And you know what you described there about naming the emotions, I read a lot of research by a social cognitive neuroscientist called Matt Lieberman, and he talks about affect labeling, which is writing down our emotions and how it's been so effective through grief. You know, journaling, writing, expressing emotions on a page, and essentially naming the emotion so that you can allow it to process, you know, so you can feel it. And I think
I think you're absolutely right. And it's so interesting how just being aware of what you're feeling can help. So after Willem died, I had some therapy, some grief counselling, and I was a bit sceptical at first. I thought, you know, how can this help? And it was probably the most important thing I did in the aftermath. And part of it was just understanding what I was feeling, being able to talk about it. But I interviewed my grief counsellor on the podcast recently, and we talked about, you know, the concept of letting your children go when they grow up. You know, how do you deal with that emotionally? You're so conditioned to love your child unconditionally, even though they are awful to you. You know, they're so demanding when they're little. It's such a hard job. And then they leave you, like they walk out of your life. It's like the hardest breakup there is. And I was like, how do you do that? And she looked at me and she said, Marina, you're finding this hard, aren't you? My children are only little. And I said, yeah, I am. It's weird because my sisters aren't finding it quite as hard. And she said, you know what? I know what the problem is for you. She said, your only experience of saying goodbye to a child, of letting go of a child, is when they died. And your brain is holding on to that I don't let this happen again. And it was so true. As soon as those words came out of her mouth, I was like, absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head. And just understanding that made me have a totally different mindset towards my children leaving. It suddenly became so much easier. And she hadn't changed anything. She hadn't sort of struck a deal with my children that they were going to come home every Christmas. I didn't need to worry. It was simply acknowledging and understanding what I was feeling and why I was feeling. And just that knowledge made all the difference. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, shifting a perception or an awareness of something is so powerful.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, back to the talking, back to the communicating. You know, I think part of therapy is talking with someone who is a fabulous communicator, having their totally focused attention. And that is, I think that's the biggest luxury in life, to be able to have, you know, the attention for someone who's just a good thinker, who's got massive empathy, and obviously then a professional understanding of what, you know, how your mind works.
Yeah, there's a beautiful book called Time to Think by Nancy Klein. And one of the quotes, which I'm paraphrasing, but I think it's almost spot on, is the quality of your attention determines the quality of the other person's thinking.
Amazing, yeah. But I do think, you know, the communication lies at the heart of a happy life. I think if all the things I can teach my children to do, if I can teach them to communicate well, that will pretty much guarantee them a happy life, because every relationship at the heart of it is communication. And if you can communicate well, your relationship will have lots of resilience, because it means that you can communicate through the hard times, through the times that are amazing. It means that in work, someone who's a great communicator is more likely to have a really rewarding job. You can persuade people to do stuff that you want you to do and like you at the same time. So I do think that is sort of one of the sort of benchmarks of being a successful person. And school, of course, teaches you that, but ultimately it's down to the parent. So if you can sort of teach your child how to communicate, and we teach them to talk, but that's just scratching the surface, to actually acknowledge what they're feeling and to get feelings out of other people. I mean, I find that like walking and talking is a brilliant way to chat. My son is 10. He definitely is getting to that sort of awkward stage now where I can sit down and go, sort of, right, tell me about how you're feeling. He's like, ah. But if we're doing something, maybe we're washing the car or we're weeding the garden or something like that, that's when that conversation, actually it's often in the car too. But we might be listening to something on the radio and something will come up, and he's a very curious person, but he definitely struggles, as I think a lot of boys that age do, with, I'm not going to tell my mummy everything that I'm feeling.
Yeah. But I love how you recognise that, it's not the formal sit down that works at that age. It's finding the moments. And I think that's true of even relationships in general, never mind just with our children, but finding the right moment and being present, giving your undivided attention and hopefully your unconditional love. And, that in itself is healing when it comes to communication. It transforms relationships in a moment, which is beautiful. And
you mentioned that unconditional love, which I think, it is the unique thing about a parental relationship with a child, because it allows you to be so honest that it allows you a degree of honesty that you probably wouldn't feel quite comfortable with other people, because that, I think ultimately if you're a good parent, your child knows that whatever they do, you'll forgive them. You'll see beyond that. You'll see, and all of us have dark thoughts and dark feelings and embarrassing. And to be able to talk about it to someone who is not bound by sort of, patient confidentiality, but is bound by this unique thing of unconditional love, means that, you can say it's okay to feel like that. And we can talk about it rather than feeling too embarrassed, to acknowledge those feelings.
Yeah. And you've said, 2 or 3 things there that really resonate. One, almost a sense of permission throughout your own journey, right? By either sharing your story or communicating honestly with your children and with others, you kind of give permission to others to do the same, right? It's almost saying it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to express. And so permission has been coming up a lot. Communication, which I think it's also important to recognize that communication is not only externally, but also internally. How are we talking to ourselves? How are we communicating with ourselves is a huge part of, resilience, essentially, of being kind to ourselves and practicing compassion and empathy, all of these things that we've talked about externally. And, so those things that you've mentioned, Marina, I think are incredibly important when it comes to developing and cultivating resilience.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I've actually learned from my podcast, actually talking about that, that internal voice and how you talk to yourself. And that's one thing I'm really bad at. My internal dialogue is so cruel to myself, so cruel. And it's something I absolutely don't want for my children, but I never even recognized that was a thing. And then I thought, gosh, you would never talk to anyone else like that. If I forget something and I'm getting in the car, I'm like, how could you be so stupid? Oh my God's sakes. But I would never say, I would say to Ben, it's not the end of the world if you forgot the keys. Let's just go back and get them. It's fine. It wouldn't be any big a deal. Yet I'm so much harsher on myself. And it's so interesting, the sort of positive, how much more effective being positive is. I was running this morning, and we live in the Chiltern Hills, so there are some pretty gnarly old hills that I'm running up. And you know, I always say to myself, and quite vocally too, I say this aloud, "Go on, Ray, you can do it. You're doing so well. Well done. You can do it. You're nearly at the top." And it's so interesting how if that internal dialogue is positive, you get to the top. Whereas if you're like, "Oh, God, you lazy old cow," you know, it's not going to happen. But you then look back to the Olympic athletes and what the coaches are saying to them. They're not going, "Oh, you're so rubbish." They're saying, "You can do it. Believe in yourself." That positive thinking is so important. And so I'm hoping that since I'm switching that, my children will hopefully inherit that sort of positive, and you know, the respect that I haven't been very good at giving myself, hopefully will be there.
Yeah, well, it sounds like this is a new awareness. I'm loving the affirmations as you run up the hill. I wonder what the neighbours think when they come out and see.
Well, do you know what? I was running up the hill just the other day, and I was running kind of through this sort of wooded bits, quite sort of small, and then there's a gate at the end, and I was really going for it. "Go on, Ronnie, you can do it." And literally, as I kind of went around the corner, there was like this couple like, "Who are you talking to?" And I was like, so embarrassed. And I told this story to my brother-in-law, and he was like, "Well, if you could have been talking at all, you weren't working hard enough." I was like, all these different perspectives. Yeah, people probably think I'm a bit crazy.
Listen, I love it. I think if everyone, you know, would speak that way to themselves out aloud as well. You know, I talk a lot about, you know, positivity, and the language that we use is so important to, you know, not only shape how we feel in the moment, but to shape our beliefs and our behaviors and how we show up. And, you know, it's plays a much bigger impact than we imagine. So I'm delighted to hear that you're bringing, you know, shining the light of awareness on it and doing your best to improve it. But it's definitely the hardest thing to overcome. I think when I started realizing the inner critic that was present all the time, I was like, wow, like, I've never noticed this guy before. This was just something that was normal. And it became frustrating at first. You know, it became something that was really difficult to overcome or try and overcome. You know, it's something that doesn't go away. But over time and through practice, you know, it definitely becomes a little bit more silent. I like the idea of running up a hill, shouting it out aloud. I think that would definitely help speed up the process.
Give it a go. Next time you're doing something really like physically hard, just give it a go. I was amazed.
Well, listen, before we wrap this up, Marina, I would, you know, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think, you know, this honest account and this honest approach to communication and the way that you share your story is hugely inspiring. And, you know, I would love to ask, for people that are going through challenges similar to the ones that you've experienced, or people that are going through, you know, a moment in their life that they are finding difficult and challenging, what advice or what words of wisdom could you share that may help them in this moment?
I think listening to people that resonate to you, whether it's in an interview, on a podcast, in a church, you know, wherever it is, I think that is probably the most helpful thing. And I think social media can be really good for that. When Willem died, it never even occurred to me to go on social media, but I have since spoken to a group of women. I interviewed this wonderful lady the other day whose son died a couple of days after he was born, and she's written an amazing book. But she talks about how from her antenatal group, she was totally ostracized. They wanted nothing to do with her, and they all didn't know what to do. And she was on her own. And then she just found some people on social media, and she ended up meeting with these women, and they'd all had a shared loss at around the same time. They were a similar age. And she called them her warriors. And she said that they were such an important part of getting through it. And I think that social media can be cruel, and it can be a difficult and unregulated world, but I think it can also be a place where you can find a needle in a haystack, that someone that you've never known, and you have different lives, and maybe even live in a different part of the world, but you're talking the same language at that moment. And I think that, especially when it comes to baby loss, partners grieve in different ways, and I speak to so many women, and they find it really difficult that their partner is not having the same emotions as they are. And you know, I think that's not very surprising, because as a woman, you've been attached to this baby, and the man hasn't. But I also think that men, I don't think they grieve any less. I think they just maybe grieve at a different time. And it's slightly fight or flight for them. And I think that can be really difficult in a relationship. So talking to another woman who has experienced something, or maybe it is another man, but they just are at the place where you are, I think that can be a really rewarding thing. I often actually, I'll have people in the bump class who lose a child, either before 12 weeks or after 12 weeks. And I always email them personally. And I always say, listen, if you want to talk to someone, I'm more than happy to chat to you. And I'm not qualified at all. But, I did this the other day, and this girl just said, thank you so much. I had no one to talk to. I have none of my friends that have gone through this. My mother just doesn't get it. And I can't tell you what a difference it made. And, it took a bit of my time, but that is such an empowering thing to be able to do. It's such an empowering thing to come out of really bleak times from my point of view. I feel like strong for being able to support women. And I think there is this cycle that it happens to you and you feel vulnerable and so raw, and you'd wonder if you'll ever come out the other side. But one thing I always say to people who've lost a child is, don't think too far in the future, because the worst has already happened. No moment is worse than the moment they tell you your child is dead. No moment is worse. And actually a lot of the fear is, how am I going to cope? Well, if you've coped with that moment of knowing that your child is not going to live, then you cope with the worst of it. And just that bit of positivity makes you feel a bit stronger. So yeah, I think finding someone you can talk to, and that might be someone that you pay. There's some great charities, Tommy's, Child Bereavement UK, both of whom are really involved in are real advocates of talking. And I know Tommy's, you have midwives that you can talk to over the phone. The NHS sometimes gives great support, sometimes you fall through the net. But really trying to find someone who speaks your language, and don't give up. If you go and see a grief counsellor and you feel like you've got nothing from it, go and see if you can see someone else, maybe see someone remotely, go onto social media. But if you persist, you will find someone that helps you, and it very often is where you least expect it.
Yeah, that's awesome, Marina. And I think, it's incredibly inspiring to hear that you've used your own experience and are now able to apply that empathy and compassion and, offering that support to others. So I think support is key. It's shown up in a lot of these videos, being able to connect and gain support from others. And I think quite often the hardest part is asking for help. So if we can encourage that in many people, then I think, there's a great message to be taken out of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's been such a pleasure to talk to you, Marina. I know that there's going to be so many people who will want to find out more about you, your work, the podcast, your books and writing. So where can people find you? How can people learn more about your work?
Probably the best thing is the podcast. It's called The Parenthood. Rather confusingly, it's 3 words, as in the hood of the parent. So you can find that on any podcast platform. So iTunes, Spotify, the podcast app on your phone. You'll be able to find that there. And we've recorded, I think, nearly 200 episodes now. And there's a real variety, everything based from sort of preconception through to the teenage years. But we have often those difficult conversations, the darker conversations. And I try to invite professionals on so that you're not just getting the sort of ruminations of someone like me, you're getting someone who has actually studied it and it is evidence-based. And do you know what? I just love my job. I have such rewarding conversations. The latest one, I was talking to a guy who is 50. He was adopted. And I wanted to talk to him about his experience of being an adopted child, growing up in the 70s in the UK, when probably communication wasn't quite as good, but also his search for his birth parents. And it's a really positive story about being adopted, which, there are so many negative ones, and I really wanted him to be able to talk about his incredibly positive relationship with his adoptive parents and his birth mother. And I felt that was a really interesting conversation to have. So we've had lots of different conversations, especially around sort of lockdown, one on kind of educating your children remotely. Another one with a wonderful woman who has written a book about people's turning points in their lives. So moments that they've just reevaluated their lives and interviewed different people and what she's learned from that. And I felt that I learned so much as a person and as a mother in terms of what really matters in life. So lots of different conversations that I've got to say I'm really proud of and I really enjoy having. So have a listen to that. There's kind of something for everyone on there.
Well, I can't wait to check out, and I think you've got a natural positive energy, Marina, to spend time with. So I hope the audience and the listeners come and check out your work. And like I said at the beginning, we're extremely grateful for you contributing your time and your energy to this campaign as well. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be involved.
Perfect. Well, listen, have an awesome day, and to everyone else, continue following our journey with Realize Resilience. If you've got any subjects you'd love us to speak about, let us know, and we will do our best to bring some content that is relevant and that resonates with you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marina. Take care.